Hey guys, welcome back. Or if you've just stumbled in here while half asleep and scrolling at 2 a.m., welcome in general. Tonight, we're gliding softly into the golden, glittering, and slightly decaying world of the 18th century. That time when rich people smelled like lavender and lead powder, and medicine was basically alchemy with extra confidence. So dim the lights, pull the blankets up, and let's talk about what happened when the world's most privileged people looked mortality in the face and decided, no thanks. Because if there's one thing the 1700s elite hated more than commoners, it was the idea of dying like one. The age of elegant denial. The 18th century was, at least on the surface, about reason, progress, and science. But underneath all that powdered rationality was a deep, desperate fear of aging. Wrinkles weren't just signs of time, they were moral failings, and the wealthy were ready to experiment their way out of them, which in practice meant swallowing a lot of dangerous substances and calling it self-care. The doctors of the day, and I use doctors loosely, promised that life could be extended if one was simply refined enough. The body, they believed, was a kind of delicate mechanism, like a fancy clock from Paris. If it started to wind down, surely it just needed a few more drops of something metallic. So began the strange, shimmering obsession with immortality through chemistry. Gold, because of course it was. Let's start with gold, the world's favorite symbol of wealth, and apparently also a great snack if you were a delusional baron in 1720. People genuinely thought drinking gold would make them live longer. Not metaphorically, literally. They called it aurum potable, or drinkable gold, and it was sold by early chemists who swore that liquefied metal could purify the soul and rejuvenate the body. A single drop could cost more than a servant's yearly wage. And the taste? Probably somewhere between rust, regret, and bankruptcy. Even Isaac Newton, yes, that Newton, gravity guy, once obsessed over the idea of extracting life essence from metals. Because when you're one of the smartest people on Earth, sometimes you still think the answer to mortality is just boiling gold longer. The aristocratic detox. Moving on to the next great cure, cleansing. If you've ever seen a wellness influencer announce a juice cleanse, congratulations, they're basically doing a modern version of 18th century medicine. Rich people loved purging, bleeding, and sweating their way toward immortality. The thinking went something like this. If you feel sick, it's because you have too much bad stuff inside you. So let's remove most of your blood and see what happens. Doctors traveled around with shiny silver bowls, leeches, and alarming enthusiasm. The elite called these detox sessions. Regular people just called them dying of treatment. There's a famous case of King George II's mistress, who was so determined to stay youthful that she scheduled monthly bloodlettings well into her 70s. She lived, technically, but looked permanently faint, which in 18th century fashion was sort of considered elegant. Mercury, the shiniest mistake in medicine. Now, if you thought drinking gold was bad, wait until you hear what they did with mercury. Mercury, quicksilver, was seen as the elixir of vitality. It moved, it gleamed, it didn't rust. To 18th century minds, that made it the perfect symbol of eternal life. Unfortunately, it was also, mercury, a literal neurotoxin. But that didn't stop doctors from prescribing it for almost everything. Wrinkles, syphilis, melancholy, even laziness. They made pills,
ointments, and even little mercury-infused wafers. Courtiers would dab a bit under the eyes to brighten the complexion, which it did, briefly, before the skin turned gray. Some went further. There are reports of nobles taking daily mercury doses, convinced it was restoring inner fire. Their hair fell out, their teeth loosened, and they continued saying things like, "I feel positively radiant." Technically, they were, just with toxic metals. And then there's the one that really sums up the 1700s. The belief that young blood could transfer vitality. No, this isn't a conspiracy theory. It's medical history. Wealthy patients were told that the vigor of youth lived in the bloodstream. So naturally, they tried to get some. There are records of elderly nobles receiving transfusions from young donors, mostly servants, of course, who were paid a few coins and a headache for their trouble. Most of these transfusions failed because the equipment was, let's say, not ideal. Tubes leaked, people fainted, the concept of sterile didn't exist yet. But the idea persisted. Some took it less literally, bathing in milk, sleeping beside healthy young people, or even keeping child companions to absorb their energy through proximity. Creepy? Yes, but in 1740 it was called science.
Royal longevity projects. Every court in Europe had its resident life extension enthusiast. In France, Louis XV's physicians brewed daily rejuvenating tonics made from crushed pearls and frog livers. In Prussia, Frederick the Great had his alchemists working on elixirs of renewal. Meanwhile, in England, the wealthy were ordering bottled essences of life from apothecaries who promised results in 30 days or a full refund, assuming you were still alive to claim it. And because these were status symbols, immortality treatments came with branding. Golden labels, crystal bottles, Latin slogans like Vita Perpetua, meaning eternal life, but make it luxury. Imagine posting your pearl and frog juice detox on Instagram. That's pretty much what they were doing, just with oil paintings. The longevity clubs. Around this time, a few eccentric gentlemen decided that simply buying immortality wasn't enough. They wanted to study it. Enter the longevity societies, early versions of wellness retreats, except instead of yoga mats, there were autopsy tables. One such club in London met monthly to discuss the perpetuation of human existence. Members included scientists, doctors, and extremely bored dukes. They drank strange herbal infusions and recorded their bowel movements for science. Their meeting notes still exist. They are both fascinating and deeply unappetizing. The group's founder lived to be 54, not bad for the 1700s, but not exactly proof of concept. Let's float over to another royal disaster. While Britain was swallowing metal, France was experimenting with electricity. After all, if sparks could reanimate a frog's leg, surely they could recharge a tired aristocrat. In Paris salons, fashionable guests would sit in circles connected by wires to a central electric globe. A crank was turned, and everyone received a light jolt, described as a tingling sensation of rejuvenation. It was marketed as electrical communion, blending science with spirituality. A few guests fainted. One woman's wig allegedly caught fire. But overall, it became the go-to party trick for anyone who wanted to feel alive, literally. Of course, no one lived longer from it, but it did make for exciting diary entries. Tonight, dined with the Duchess, was electrified thrice, felt renewed. Hair now smells faintly of ozone.
Sleep paranoid aristocrats. And finally, we reach the nightly rituals, the routines of those who were so obsessed with life that they became terrified of sleep itself, because to them, sleep was a tiny rehearsal for death. So they fought it with caffeine, wine, and an endless stream of stimulating tonics. Queen Caroline of Ansbach reportedly refused to sleep in the dark, believing that shadow itself drained life energy. She had servants keep dozens of candles burning all night. Expensive, exhausting, and terrible for fire safety. Meanwhile, her husband, George II, countered mortality by pacing for hours, convinced that movement delayed decay. Neither of them cracked 80, but they did manage to turn bedtime into an Olympic event. Hey again. Still awake? Barely? Perfect. That's exactly how this is meant to sound. Tonight we're floating deeper into the strange, spiritual, and slightly sweatish side of 18th century immortality, where holy men brewed elixirs, royals boiled herbs, and everyone quietly ignored that none of it was working. Because by now, the rich had tried gold, mercury, and electricity. The next logical step was, apparently, God and mineral water. The monks who bottled eternal life. Let's start in the Alps. Crisp air, candlelight, and the smell of fermentation. Hidden away in monasteries across Europe, monks were distilling all sorts of mysterious liquids. They called them elixirs of life. To outsiders, this sounded holy and promising. In reality, most of these brews were extremely strong herbal liqueurs, what we'd now call digestifs. Think chartreuse, Benedictine, or whatever else burns on the way down but feels medicinal if you're desperate enough. The monks claimed divine inspiration, but really, they were just better chemists than the doctors. They used herbs that actually did things. Mint for digestion, sage for inflammation, and enough alcohol to make you forget you were dying. Nobles sent servants on long, treacherous journeys to fetch these monastic potions. Bottles arrived in velvet boxes, labeled in Latin, and smelled faintly like pine, myrrh, and misplaced faith. And somehow they worked. Or at least people said they did. But that might have been the 70-proof ethanol talking. Spa culture and the birth of wellness travel. As the century rolled on, Europe's elite discovered their next obsession: mineral springs. They believed that if you soaked long enough in slightly sulfur-smelling water, you'd absorb the Earth's vitality right through your pores. Bath, Carlsbad, Baden-Baden. Suddenly, these sleepy little towns were the 1700s equivalent of luxury retreats. There were pamphlets promising revival of the blood, return of youth, and cleansing of the mind. No one mentioned the faint whiff of rotten eggs. At the bath spa in England, nobles would rise at dawn, shuffle toward the steaming pool, and lower themselves in with the solemnity of people doing penance for existing. They'd sit there for hours, murmuring polite conversation through clouds of sulfur vapor. Meanwhile, in France, aristocrats preferred to drink their spa water. Because why just bathe in disappointment when you can also taste it? Drinking the waters became a fashionable phrase. It sounded healthy, though in practice it meant sipping something that smelled like coins. King Louis XV's court physician swore that daily spa treatments renewed the essence of the soul. He also happened to own shares in the mineral company.
The rise of vital airs. Of course, some scientists thought water was old news. The real magic, they insisted, was in the air. This was the age of chemistry's awkward adolescence. Scientists had just discovered gases, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrous oxide, and immediately began inhaling them recreationally. Wealthy patrons built pneumatic salons where guests could breathe vital airs to refresh their lungs and lengthen their lives. Picture a bunch of powdered aristocrats sitting in a gilded room taking turns with a glass tube, politely giggling as their brains flooded with laughing gas. They called it inhaling vitality. We'd call it a Friday night at the dentist's office. One London noble even commissioned a portable air machine, a brass cylinder you could carry to the countryside and fill it with your gas of choice. He said it made him feel as young as Apollo. He died 2 years later from complications of gout. Alchemists still refused to quit. Meanwhile, the old dreamers, the alchemists, were still at it. Even though real chemists had taken over laboratories, there were plenty of private mystics clinging to the idea that lead could become gold and men could become immortal. These late alchemists were half scientists, half storytellers. They wore velvet robes, carried vials of mysterious powders, and claimed to have seen the philosopher's stone with their inner sight. In Germany, Count Cagliostro made an entire career out of this. He was a charming fraud, healer, magician, and part-time con man who sold rejuvenating elixirs at exclusive soirees. His secret ingredient was, allegedly, solarized dew. In practice, it was probably brandy and perfume. He promised eternal youth to wealthy widows, cured imaginary diseases, and held seances where spirits supposedly whispered recipes for life extension. And for a while, it worked. The Paris elite adored him. He even claimed to be centuries old. Eventually, he was arrested for fraud. But his legend outlived him, which, ironically, was the closest anyone came to immortality in that century. Let's drift over to the royal laboratories. Some kings weren't content to just buy potions. They wanted to make their own. Frederick the Great of Prussia, for instance, had a personal chemistry lab inside his palace. He'd spend evenings in there mixing unknown substances while his generals waited for orders. He believed that alchemy was the most noble of sciences, which sounds poetic until you remember he once tried to melt silver coins to extract moon essence. In Russia, Catherine the Great also caught the immortality bug, though she took a more scientific approach. She funded studies on diet, hygiene, and sleep, convinced that clean living might slow decay. Her courtiers teased her for it, calling her the Empress of Moderation, which is basically the 18th century way of saying buzzkill. Still, she lived to 67, which was practically a record at the time. Maybe skipping the mercury helped.
The cult of celestial energy. By the late 1700s, things took a spiritual turn. Europe was buzzing, literally, with talk of invisible energies. Enter Franz Mesmer, the man who gave us the word mesmerize. He claimed that every living thing was filled with a magnetic fluid, a cosmic life force that could be adjusted for better health. His method? A mix of magnets, soft music, and dramatic hand movements. Patients would gather around a magnetic tub filled with iron rods, hold hands, and fall into trances. Some cried, some fainted. Some said they felt eternal youth flowing through them. Mesmer dressed in lilac silk and had the charisma of a man who absolutely believed in himself. His sessions were half therapy, half theater, and for a while, everyone, from duchesses to philosophers, was convinced he'd cracked the secret of vitality. Of course, it turned out to be mostly hypnosis. But in fairness, hypnosis probably did less harm than mercury, so progress was progress. The gentle decline of hope. By the end of the century, a quiet realism settled in. After decades of swallowing metals, breathing gases, and bathing in questionable waters, even the most determined immortality seekers began to notice they were still aging. Doctors rebranded. Instead of promising eternal life, they started talking about prolonged life. Elixirs became tonics. Alchemy became chemistry. And slowly, the dream of immortality transformed into the dream of wellness, something a little more vague, a little more marketable. A philosopher of the time wrote, "If man cannot live forever, let him at least live fashionably," which basically summed up the 18th century. Vanity over biology, elegance over accuracy. The most immortal thing they actually achieved. Ironically, while their bodies failed, their obsessions didn't. Every detox smoothie, every anti-aging serum, every vitamin ad claiming to revitalize your cells. It's all a faint echo of these powdered nobles trying to cheat decay with gold dust and optimism. They didn't live forever, but their marketing ideas sure did. Turns out, the secret to immortality wasn't chemistry or prayer. It was branding.
Hey again. Welcome back. If you're still here, or if you fell asleep halfway through mercury tonics and somehow woke up now, congratulations. You've successfully time-traveled about 100 years. We've drifted into the 1800s, the world of steam, corsets, and serious sideburns. And even though people were inventing trains and telegrams, the human obsession with not dying hadn't changed at all. It just got more respectable. Because now, instead of monks and alchemists, you had doctors in lab coats saying the same things, only with Latin words and better lighting. Science learns to talk fancy. By the mid-19th century, medicine finally started being something you could trust, at least slightly. Microscopes were new, hospitals were getting cleaner, and doctors had stopped wearing powdered wigs, which was already an improvement for everyone involved. But trust the science still meant hope for the best. The boundaries between chemistry, faith, and outright fantasy were beautifully blurry. Every few years, a new headline appeared. Man discovers the secret of rejuvenation, vital energy captured in liquid form. And the upper classes kept lining up for the next great cure, anything that promised to reverse time without requiring humility. The blood tonic boom. If you could bottle vitality, Victorians would buy it, preferably in glass embossed with words like invigorating or electrifying. Enter the tonic era. These were the direct descendants of 18th century elixirs, but now they came with medical endorsements and occasionally a dash of cocaine. Restorative wines, vital elixirs, and rejuvenating syrups lined pharmacy shelves. They all promised to refresh the blood, sharpen the mind, and awaken the forces of life. The ingredients? Usually alcohol, opium, and maybe some iron filings for that metallic crunch. Aristocrats adored them. Writers adored them even more. Charles Dickens swore by invincible iron tonic. Queen Victoria herself reportedly enjoyed Vin Mariani, a coca leaf wine that gave her energy and composure, which is one way to describe being slightly high on medical cocaine. It worked until it didn't. By the time someone figured out these tonics were mildly addictive, most of Britain was too relaxed to care. Early cryonics. Yes, really. But some Victorians wanted something grander than a good buzz. They wanted to skip dying altogether. A few doctors became obsessed with preserving the human body at death, convinced that future science would one day reawaken it. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's early cryonics, minus the liquid nitrogen. In 1868, a French physician named Jean-Baptiste von Sagraffus proposed freezing people at the threshold of death to be revived later. He even published sketches of glass coffins filled with cooling gases, a concept both morbid and wildly optimistic, given that refrigeration barely worked on meat at the time. No one successfully froze themselves, but the idea stuck. It told the Victorian rich that maybe, just maybe, money could buy a second chance at life. Eventually. A sort of afterlife on layaway.
The return of the electric dream. Electricity also staged the comeback. After Mesmer's mystical magnetism faded, Victorians decided to try something more scientific, actual shock therapy.
They built electro-bath chairs, vitality belts, and even electrified hairbrushes. Each device claimed to stimulate the life current within. Advertisements promised, restore your youth through gentle galvanic influence. There were even electric corsets designed to send mild currents through the torso, marketed as slimming, rejuvenating, and reharmonizing female energies. What they really did was make women slightly tingle and occasionally pass out. But hey, progress. By the 1880s, the wealthy could attend full-body electrical rejuvenation sessions, basically lying in a metal cage while sparks danced overhead. It was equal parts terrifying and fashionable, like a cross between a science fair and a seance. Let's glide over to the blood doctors. Now, let's talk about the Victorians' favorite obsession, blood. It was still the symbol of life, and now that microscopes could actually see it, everyone wanted to improve it. Doctors began offering blood restoration treatments, transfusions, infusions, and injections of various concoctions. The theory was that if your blood looked tired under the microscope, you could just top it up with something livelier. In 1880, a Scottish doctor tried injecting goat blood into patients suffering from general fatigue. He claimed success, although he also admitted the goats were unusually healthy to begin with. Another English surgeon suggested youth transfusions from healthy young men into aging noblemen. No one said out loud how the donors felt about it. The results were mixed, but that didn't stop society papers from calling it the new fountain of youth. Because when you're rich, every bad idea just needs good marketing. The diet of eternal cleanliness. As germ theory arrived, immortality took a moral turn. If filth caused disease, then cleanliness could prevent death. Simple logic, really. The rich embraced hygiene with religious fervor. Soap, toothbrushes, and cold baths became symbols of virtue. Doctors insisted that dirt was death itself in disguise. Some people took this to alarming extremes. The health reformer Sylvester Graham, of Graham Crackers fame, preached that clean living, vegetarianism, celibacy, and moral restraint would extend human life indefinitely. He died at 57. Meanwhile, a group of wealthy Londoners adopted the air bath, standing naked by an open window every morning to let the pure oxygen of life cleanse the pores. Imagine the neighbors. Still, compared to mercury tonics, fresh air wasn't the worst idea they ever had. The resurrection scientists. By the late Victorian era, immortality dreams got a new twist. Maybe you didn't have to avoid death. Maybe you could just undo it. This was the era of Frankenstein, after all. Electricity, chemistry, and medicine were all blurring together into one grand experiment. Serious doctors began wondering if death was really permanent. After all, if a frog's leg could twitch when shocked, who's to say a human couldn't? In 1896, a Russian scientist named Alexander Bogdanov began studying blood rejuvenation between animals and humans. He believed that swapping blood might exchange vitality. He later became one of the first recorded cases of dying from a transfusion experiment. History has a dark sense of humor. There were also reports of post-mortem experiments in Europe, attempts to restart the hearts of the newly dead using electric currents. Most failed, a few twitched, and society quietly pretended not to notice how creepy it was getting. Beauty was the new immortality. When medicine failed, vanity stepped in. By 1900, the focus shifted from living forever to looking like you might. Enter the birth of modern cosmetics. Creams, powders, and miracle serums promised to renew skin vitality and arrest the march of time. If you couldn't actually live forever, you could at least seem timeless under dim lighting. Paris became the capital of scientific beauty. One popular facial treatment involved bee venom, electric rollers, and a generous layer of lead-based powder. Clients called it revitalizing. Their doctors called it concerning. Still, everyone glowed, in more ways than one. The gentle fade of the dream. By the early 20th century, the immortality chase quietly slowed down. Science had grown up. Germ theory had matured, and suddenly, people realized that maybe, just maybe, you couldn't outthink mortality with champagne and static electricity.
But the rich didn't stop trying, they just rebranded again. Immortality became longevity. Alchemy became biomedical research. And the dream lived on, cleaner, quieter, and with fewer goat transfusions. A few thinkers even started saying something revolutionary, that maybe the goal wasn't to live forever, but to live comfortably enough to forget about dying for a while. A bit less glamorous, but far more realistic.
Hey again, dreamers. Still with me? If you've made it through mercury cocktails, electric corsets, and goat blood, congratulations. You've basically survived the entire medical history of bad ideas. Now we've reached the 1900s, where science got confident, money got louder, and immortality briefly looked like it might be possible, if only you were rich enough or weird enough to try. The age of biological bravery. By the early 20th century, medicine had actually started working. Antibiotics were on the horizon, surgery had gone sterile, and people were beginning to live past 40 without divine intervention. Naturally, this progress made some men think, why stop there? Doctors were now biologists. Alchemists had been reborn as physiologists, and their new playground wasn't gold or mercury anymore. It was the body itself. Specifically, hormones. And if you think that sounds like trouble, you're absolutely right. The monkey gland movement. Yes, really. Let's start in Paris, 1920s. Dr. Serge Voronov, Russian by birth, French by ambition, had a radical idea. Aging wasn't inevitable. It was simply a matter of low vitality. And he believed he'd found the cure. His method? Transplanting thin slices of monkey testicle tissue into older men to restore their vigor. He called it the rejuvenation operation. His patients called it life-changing. Historians call it deeply concerning. Voronov's clinic became the toast of European high society. Dukes, barons, and retired generals lined up for the procedure. One even claimed he could now dance like a youth and eat like a lion, which, to be fair, are decent retirement goals. The press adored it. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Science defeats time," "Eternal youth found in a monkey." Within a few years, Voronov's fame spread to America, where a Texan surgeon started offering similar rejuvenations using goat glands. It became a brief medical craze, a sort of biological gold rush for virility. The craze died when, predictably, no one got younger. But for a while, Europe genuinely believed the secret of eternal life was just a well-placed primate organ away. The rejuvenation factories. The 1930s saw a new twist, industrial immortality. Now that chemistry was booming, labs began mass-producing tonics, pills, and injections, claiming to renew the tissues. In Germany, scientists worked on youth serums using placenta extracts. In America, pharmaceutical companies sold vitamin life enhancers in sleek aluminum tins. Everyone was rejuvenating, and no one dared to ask for proof. One of the most famous products was Gerovital H3, a Romanian formula that promised to delay aging through hormone balance. It was banned in some countries, celebrated in others, and consumed faithfully by movie stars who didn't want to know what was in it. The tone had changed, though. Gone were the powdered nobles drinking gold. Now it was men in gray suits injecting optimism under fluorescent lights.
Cryonics, the cold comfort of the future. Then came the 1960s, the space age, the transistor age, and inevitably, the freeze-yourself-until-someone-figures-it-out age. Cryonics was the natural evolution of all that 18th century optimism. Why chase immortality now when you could just pause yourself and wait for smarter people to handle it later? The first person to be cryonically frozen was a psychology professor named James Bedford in 1967. His body was preserved at -196 degrees Celsius in liquid nitrogen, under the promise that one day science would revive him. He's technically still there, frozen for over half a century, quietly becoming a legend and possibly a science project in waiting. For the wealthy, this was irresistible. Cryonics clubs popped up in California and New York. Brochures showed happy people being thawed in the future, like microwavable meals of hope. The science was shaky, but the fantasy was perfect. It sounded like control, like cheating the one rule no amount of gold, mercury, or monkey glands had ever broken. Silicon Valley discovers death and decides it's optional. Fast forward to now, where billionaires talk about aging the way medieval kings talked about dragons, something to be slain. Today's immortality industry is sleek, data-driven, and slightly delusional in new and exciting ways. Instead of elixirs of life, we have longevity startups. Instead of monks with herbs, we have CEOs on podcasts. They fund Cryonics 2.0, blood transfusions from young donors, genetic reprogramming, and age reversal pills that sound suspiciously like vitamins. There's even a biotech company whose mission statement literally reads, "We're making death optional." Sure you are. Some of these billionaires sleep in oxygen pods. Some track every calorie, hormone, and blink. Some even implant microchips that monitor cellular decay, as if the body were a phone battery that just needs a better charger. It's the same 1700s logic, just with Wi-Fi. The great paradox: the more we know, the less we believe it. Modern immortality research has become a fascinating contradiction. The more science learns about biology, the more it realizes how unbelievably complex life is and how fragile. We now understand telomeres, DNA repair, mitochondrial decay, and all of it basically boils down to you can slow it, but you can't stop it. Yet the dream persists, dressed up in lab reports and venture funding. We can now extend lifespans by decades, but not forever. And maybe that's okay, because if history teaches anything, it's that the rich have always tried to buy time, and time has always politely declined. The immortality business never dies. Even now, the industry thrives. In California, you can pay to have your head preserved for future reanimation. In Switzerland, anti-aging clinics offer bespoke stem cell infusions for $100,000 a year. There's longevity influencers who sell lifestyle plans promising biological age reversal. It's the same pattern in new clothes, science mixed with marketing, optimism laced with denial. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of those 18th century nobles whispering through time. Have you tried gold water? It worked wonders for me. The gentle ending they never found. Maybe immortality was never really about living forever. Maybe it was just about refusing to accept endings. From monks stirring herbs in mountain abbeys, to kings swallowing mercury, to billionaires booking plasma transfusions, it's all the same heartbeat: fear, vanity, and the very human wish that life might be just a little longer. The irony, of course, is that the more we chase immortality, the less we live in the moment. The nobles wasted their lives searching for elixirs. The Victorians aged in laboratories, and now millionaires spend their youth trying not to get old. Meanwhile, the rest of the world quietly does the one thing none of them could: live, grow old, and occasionally take a nap. So the final thought, softly now. So what happened to the dream of immortality? It never died, it just got better branding and worse lighting. The alchemists called it the philosopher's stone. The Victorians called it the elixir of youth. The 21st century calls it biohacking. But at heart, it's the same bedtime story: That maybe if you have enough faith, enough science, or enough money, you can stop the clock. And yet here we are, 2 hours later, still drifting gently toward sleep, still mortal, still curious, still beautifully human. So rest easy, because immortality may be overrated, but a good night's sleep, that's priceless.
Hey again, Wanderer. If you're still awake, you've officially outlasted 1,000 years of immortality experiments, which, by 18th century standards, makes you something of a miracle yourself. Let's take a deep, unhurried breath and step into the final room of our tale, the one where kings, alchemists, doctors, and dreamers finally realize the obvious. The only thing harder than escaping death is making peace with it. The subtle shift. By the late 1800s, something curious happened among Europe's upper class. After centuries of elixirs and gland grafts, a quiet fatigue settled in. The miracle tonics still lined the apothecary shelves, of course, but the people buying them had changed. They weren't hunting for eternal life anymore. They were looking for a graceful way to die without looking ridiculous. Funerals became aesthetic projects. Tombs were commissioned like art. Victorian widows staged mourning portraits that looked almost serene. Death hadn't been conquered, it had simply been redesigned. The cult of legacy. When the body refused to cooperate, the wealthy pivoted to something they could control: remembrance. If they couldn't live forever, they'd make sure their names did. Libraries, hospitals, and entire towns sprouted from this logic. Not so much acts of charity as well-placed time capsules. It's a different kind of immortality, really. Not in flesh, but in marble, ink, and the occasional bronze statue that pigeons would one day defile. Andrew Carnegie donated libraries. The Medicis built chapels. Emperors wrote their memoirs. Each believed that being remembered was almost as good as not dying. And perhaps it is. The romanticization of death. The poets noticed too. The romantics of the 19th century, Byron, Shelley, Keats, didn't fear death, they flirted with it. They wrote odes to fading beauty and gentle decay. They made mortality fashionable. It was the first time in centuries that humans spoke of death without bargaining. Instead of elixirs, they poured wine. Instead of laboratories, they kept journals. They didn't want to live forever. They wanted their feelings to. And that, strangely, worked.
Modern echoes. Fast forward again to today's billionaires, those slick heirs to the alchemists. Even they, for all their data and labs, eventually reach the same philosophical dead end. You can inject stem cells, freeze your head, and monitor your telomeres, but at the end of it, you're still human. And the most human thing of all is the moment when you quietly accept that truth. Some of the richest now speak publicly about legacy over longevity. They fund scholarships, climate projects, digital archives. They want to leave something behind that lasts longer than the body ever could. Which, in a way, means the story has come full circle, from gold to goodwill, from elixirs to endowments. The soft resolution. So here we are, floating gently at the end of a long, slow narrative. Centuries of effort, billions of coins, gallons of mercury, and not a single immortal body to show for it. And yet, maybe that's comforting, because the truth hiding underneath every royal obsession and billionaire experiment is that life's value was never in its length. It was in its texture, the absurd, fragile, funny little details along the way. The powdered wig that caught fire at a banquet. The doctor who injected goat hormones with full confidence. the tycoon who microdosed on hope and called it science. They all shared the same heartbeat, the wish to matter, to continue, to not be forgotten. And here we are, centuries later, still talking about them. So in a strange way, they got what they wanted. The candle burns low. If you're still awake, let the last of this story blur at the edges. Imagine the laboratories going dark, the glass jars cooling, the noblemen closing their ledgers, and the world exhaling softly as it turns toward sleep.